Hello, Jean-Christophe. How are you?
Hello, Kuhn. Very good. And you?
Oh, very good. I'm very happy that you've been participating to the book, the RegTech Black Book.
So,
And
so-
it's kind of funny because we know each other already since 2014. And the
yes,
first time we met was in Brussels. And very short after, we were both part of the financial think tank in Belgium,
that is
which I
correct.
thought was a particularly funny time. I'm sure you remember.
I do remember indeed.
Do
The
remember.
two ideas that came out of there.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, and now we are 4 days later, or actually five, I should be more precise. And we now have written a book, and it was such a pleasure to have you as a writer. And what I liked particularly about your input into the book was that you, of course, have been a banker for so many years, and still you came with a twist. So maybe you can explain the audience a little bit what that twist was about.
Well, after I left the banking world, I was appointed into a show business company that was doing those mega shows that usually tour around the world or sometimes stop in the city. And I basically discovered that a lot of the things that I was doing in the banking industry could be replicated into the show business industry, which is
Mm-hmm.
diametrically opposite from the banking industry with a few modifications. And that is actually what gave me the idea to write about one topic that I learned into the banking world doing it, which was the risk management.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And why that twist actually? Because I guess it must be strange to go from the banking world into the show business industry.
That is a little bit due to my grandfather who used to be in the show business, and when the opportunity appeared, I jumped on it because I said, why not repeat the experience that was running in my family for a very long time and see a little bit what show business was all about. And that's how I
Nice.
ended up into the show business for a little bit less than a year.
And can you describe the moment, Jean-Christophe, where you realized like, wow, really, the show business is not so much different than our banking industry?
I realized it when basically we started to think about risk into the show business. And I realized that to implement the risk framework, you could basically recycle everything that was written into the banking regulation because it gave you a framework of analysis that was ensuring a kind of exhaustivity into the exercise. And that's how it came up. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it started opening doors into that company on topics that they were absolutely not considering, like the financial risks that they were running. They were just considering risks like a performer falling from 15 meters high flat on the ground, that kind of things. But they never considered all the side risks that they had in the corporation. When you are in a bank, actually, you have that exhaustivity of risk where you have to consider everything that can happen. And fortunately for the financial world, uh, the regulators have worked so much into documenting everything that you end up with a framework that is very useful as a basis for implementing risk in more or less any type of company or any type.
Mm-hmm. And what was the reaction of the audience? Because I can imagine the day that you said, "Hey guys, I've seen Valhalla. Actually, you're in a banking industry." So how did they react then?
At first the reaction was a little bit cold, to say the least, because you come up with something that is very organized into something that by definition is often very disorganized because of the people or the
Mm-hmm.
character of the people that worked into it. But then they quickly realized that that type of approach, when applied throughout the company, so that type of approach, meaning something that is organized, something that comes with methodology, they
Mm-hmm.
could drive some benefits from it in either going faster to the results or delivering higher quality because they would have more time to think about what they were doing using a methodology than trying to find their ways through the maze that is a project of building a show.
Oh yeah, I can understand that. And how does that then relate to the more modern term RegTech? Well, how do you see the link between both?
It regulates it links back in the fact that when you take risk management into banking industry, risk management is a regulation at the end of the day. It's something that you have to do and that was imposed initially a little bit in a matter of way in the banks, because looking at the risks that they were running more on the trading side than anything else. And then regulation started to kick in, and it started to be, quote unquote, imposed to the banking business through a regulation. The exact same way that a lot of industries nowadays have regulations being pushed down on them, whatever the industries they're in. So to give you an example, the typical example that everybody sees for the moment is the RGPD, which is something that in the bank was done, especially in Belgium, traditionally, because there was the banking secrecy. And when you look at GDPR from a banking perspective, there is nothing really new into this. But when you read that from a show business perspective, it's drastically new because you're not used to that. And that type of regulation is going basically down and it's pushed down to every level of company, every size of company, and to every industry at the same time. And a lot of things that are done in banks gradually, either because of regulations per se or by market practice that are not that far away from regulations at the end of the day, a lot of things that are done in banks or insurance companies will be pushed naturally to other industries and then down to the different size of companies. RGPD being the best example that you have. You can have another one that is fairly known to a lot of people, that is the regulation around the food industry. So if you take a restaurant nowadays...
Interesting twist.
Yeah, but if you take a restaurant nowadays, you can't have a restaurant without applying the rules of the food regulation industry. Before, anybody could open up a restaurant and it was okay. So that's also the kind of industry that gradually gets regulated. And I think that whatever the industry you're in the future, you won't have the choice but to follow a regulation. And that is where RegTech, so the technology applied to regulations, becomes important.
No, I actually very much like this approach, because for all people into RegTech, it also allows us to think just wider than the banking industry, and it allows us also to explore new worlds in terms of the different solutions that are being brought into RegTech more generally. So what could you consider yourself, more to be reg or more to be tech?
I'm in between, actually, because I used to do a lot of regulations and a lot of technology in the past. So nowadays I'm more onto the reg side of things. Even if I keep a very deep interest for everything that is done at the technological level, I'm more into the regulation and implementation of regulations into different industries. That's what I do most of my time. And to give you an example, for the moment, I'm working on tools to implement GDPR into small and medium-sized corporations.
Okay. Well, again, it feels like this challenging environment where you bring this regulatory insights, and we know that it has to be applied by companies, but then I guess the challenge is there also to change culture. Is that something that you feel with all the examples that you mentioned?
There is a drastic change of culture that needs to take place. I think that gradually, whatever the size of company, whatever the industry, you're going to have to implement more industrial size type of behaviors into corporations. So the time where you were left in your little corner running your little business the way you want it, I think it's gradually getting over. Now that raises another question, which is, if you run a business a very specialized business. Let's say that you craft you craft wood in order to do furniture. Your strength is into crafting wood. It's not into the regulation that goes around it, which brings an opportunity for everybody working in the regulation, whatever the regulation is, go and support these companies so that they can basically focus on their core business. And I know it sounds very much like consulting, but that's the truth. They can focus on their core business and not spend too much energy into following a regulation. That is one. And then the second thing that you're going to need gradually into corporations is a little bit more of a standard governance process throughout the companies, where you basically step aside, take the time to look at what's happening into the corporation, be it from a regulatory perspective, be it from a risk perspective or financial perspective, whatever, but step aside, look at what's happening, make decisions, implement, and run into the standard circles that you see into risk management and into governance, and that allow you to better manage the company. And at the end of the day, also gives you an opportunity to grow faster, because if you don't have these meetings, you're always producing, and you lose sight of where you want to go and what the problems might be that might come into your face in the next 5 to 6 months.
The way you say it, it almost feels that you own the problem. Is it something that keeps you awake at night?
It sometimes keeps you awake. It keeps me awake at night because, for a simple reason, I run a small consulting firm for the moment. And when you realize the time that these processes take, for the implementation of GDPR in a company where you have people that are geared towards implementing this and implementing it at the same time you need to run your business, it takes time, it takes energy, it costs a lot of money at the end of the day, even for small corporations. That is somewhat problematic. What I was describing about everything that revolves around governance is something that again takes time, energy, and usually it needs to be done outside office hours. That's the end story of what I see. And because sometimes it needs to be done outside of office hours, it simply doesn't take place.
And so you said you run your own consultancy firm. Is that also typically something that people you should contact you about, or are there any other topics that you say I'm free to help, or why should I contact you?
Yeah, well, we help mainly into the governance issues into corporations, into the implementation of some regulations, not all of them, because we don't know all of them. It's simply impossible. And we deal mostly with what my strengths were in the past and still are, which is the finance, of the operational finance and the risk management, both from a framework perspective and from sizing perspective. So putting a figure on the risks that you run within a corporation.
Oh, interesting. Maybe one last question before we wrap up this interview. What would be a good advice that you could give to our younger generation while reading this book, and more particularly your article?
Don't do it the same way I do it for the moment, which means be a little bit more pragmatic and organized into approaching things. You're going to go faster than if you try to find your way around. That would be my advice to younger generations when they start any kind of projects or any kind of company venture that they want to set up.
So I'll take that very much personally as being a younger generation myself. Jean-Christophe, I would like to thank you so much. Thank you very much for this interview. Thank you also very much for participating to the Black Book.
You're very welcome.
I'm sure we will hear a lot more about you, and I'm looking forward to read more content and to get more insights in the near future.
Thank you very much, Koen. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.